Hi everyone, this is Mackenzie Hoyer, and I am teaching AP Biology at Randall K. Cooper High School in Boone County, Kentucky. And this is a series that I've actually done before, but am starting up again in order to kind of streamline the process and fit it better into my new school. So this is actually the first video in my series. I know we are starting with Unit 8 and starting with topic 8.1. Today we're going to talk about the responses to the environment that are exhibited by both animals and plants and some of the implications therein, some of the signaling that goes on. So we're going to touch on quite a bit of chapters 31 from the Biology in Focus textbook and chapter 39 from the Biology in Focus textbook. So without further ado, here we go. Starting off, I just wanted to kind of introduce the idea of behavioral ecology. When we talk about ecology, and this whole first unit is going to be about ecology in all the different facets, we're talking specifically about animal and plant behavior. I know you may not think about plants as having behaviors, but they do have responses to their environment. And so we're going to kind of look at this as a whole bit. And we're going to look at the ecology behind that. So how are things related to their interactions with the environment and to other organisms, whether they be the same species or different species, and how evolution really drives these types of behaviors to be exhibited. When we look at behavioral ecology, we're really going to focus on the proximate and ultimate causes of that behavior. So we're going to address four major questions, those being what stimulus elicits the behavior and what physiological mechanisms mediate the response. How does the animal's experience during growth and development influence response? So those are our proximate questions. And then our ultimate questions include things like, how does the behavior aid survival and reproduction? And what is the behavior's evolutionary history? We're going to touch on a couple of different types of behaviors, those that include innate and learned behaviors when we're focusing on animals. And then at the very end, we'll come back to plants. So starting off with the most basic of behaviors, these are what are known as fixed action patterns. Fixed action patterns are immediate responses to what we call a sign stimulus or an external cue. Now, the pattern that we're talking about is going to be a series of actions that are innate in the organism. So the organism just does them automatically, whether it is related to brain chemistry or a series of genetic components that tell them how to respond to this particular cue. The unique thing about fixed action patterns is that these are unchangeable, that once they're initiated, they are carried into completion. So we have a couple of good examples of fixed action patterns that come up in the textbook, specifically chapter 39, if you are looking in the textbook. And those are the responses of the three-spined stickleback to red-bottomed fish. These will create an aggressive response. And it doesn't matter what the shape is, as long as it is red, they will respond in an aggressive manner. We see something very similar with geese in that if an egg falls out of the nest, they will instinctively roll that egg back in. It doesn't matter if it's an actual egg or if we swap it out with something completely different. They will respond in the same way. They will carry this pattern of actions through to completion. I have included a couple of videos here. I'm not going to play them right now, but I will link them in the video that I will post on YouTube. So if you want to go and look at these videos, please, they are some really cool examples of these fixed action patterns. So when we talk about behaviors and how organisms respond to stimuli, we're looking for cues. These cues allow organisms to find their way through environments that they have not previously encountered. So they have the idea, the understanding of how things function within the environment around them. And so they can apply this later on, and we're going to talk about learning in a little bit, to novel situations. And that increases the survivability or the fitness of the organism in question. And when we're talking about these innate ideas of how organisms move, these cues can come from a variety of sources. So, for example, organisms will often use cues in order to guide migration. Migration being a regular, long distance change in location. It can be annular, it can be semi-annular, it can deal with the seasons. But it's usually based on cues that they receive in from the environment. For example, relative position to the sun or to stars can help guide this migration through the use of what we call a circadian clock. Very similar to a circadian rhythm, if you have heard that term before, where we kind of start to develop different hormones at different times of day based on how much sunlight we're receiving. Think melatonin if you need to get some sleep at night, or when you're on an airplane and you get that jet lag because you're no longer being able to rely on your position relative to the sun. So the circadian clock is a mechanism that enables you to use this 24-hour activity cycle based on changes in the sun's position, and it allows you to orient yourself within the environment. Some organisms use the magnetic field, something that we as humans may or may not be able to experience, but other organisms can pick up on this quite well. All of these cues environmentally, we receive the information and then we respond to the information in a specific way. So we are seeing this response to a stimulus that is guiding our everyday activity. I got a little ahead of myself. I wrote this PowerPoint a while back, but so when we talk about circadian rhythm, again, we're talking about the amount of sunlight that we are receiving, and that is dealing with how much of certain hormones we're creating and how alert we feel or how tired we feel. So when we deal with cases where maybe we're not able to sleep quite as well, I know as teenagers, you probably experience that on a daily basis. We may have a disruption in our circadian rhythm, perhaps due to the blue light of our phones. So if you're watching this really late at night, please go to bed, turn off your screen, and come back and see me in the morning. But that is another great example of a circadian rhythm. And all of what we've talked about so far, we're talking about this communication pathway where we are receiving a signal that is a stimulus and we are responding in turn. Now, the types of communication that are part of that response fall under a wide variety of different types. We can talk visual communication. We can talk auditory communication. So you see something bright, you respond to it. You hear something loud, you respond to it. We can talk chemical communication, where we have a release of pheromones, or if we're talking on the cellular level, hormones. And these signals that we receive enable us to respond. So this is one thing that we will come back to later on in a future unit when we talk specifically about how cells communicate. But we can have electrical communication as another one that kind of falls under the radar. Olfactory communication. These are all things that deal with our senses, even if we as humans do not have a sense organ for a particular type of communication, other organisms do. Whatever we're dealing with in terms of this, though, the idea is the same. we have a signal that is a stimulus, and that elicits a response from the organism, and that response will in turn affect how we interact with our environment. So one of the types of communications that I mentioned was that of chemical communication. And when we are dealing with chemical communication in the external environment, we are talking about pheromones. Pheromones are these chemical signals that can be released from things like glands, whether that's sebaceous or glandular, and they carry with them a wide swath of information that can be received by the appropriate receiver. You do have to have receiving abilities for these pheromones in order to get that message and know how to respond to it. For example, one of the great examples of pheromone use and application is that of bees. Queen bees release a variety of different types of pheromones that elicit different responses within the workers. This is how we're able to get that active colony where everyone knows what they're supposed to do. We know what our job is. We know how to respond to this because we're receiving those signals from the queen. And as we get into these pheromones, all these signals that we have talked about so far are examples of innate behaviors. Innate behaviors are instinctive. They are in the genetics of the organism in question. So we're talking about things that you have genes that dictate how you respond to the environment. And being genes, it means that we inherit them from our parents. Because if something survives from being able to respond to their environment, that means that this is a beneficial response. We have increased our fitness, we have increased our survivability, and therefore we are more likely to pass on that particular trait or genetic basis to our offspring. So as long as we are surviving, as long as we're surviving long enough to reproduce, that's an important one, we are able to shift that selection to organisms that exhibit these characteristics, these behaviors. We'll talk about natural selection all the way at the very end in my class. We're going to come back to Unit 7, but evolution is embedded everywhere. We're going to talk about how our genetics dictate how well we survive in our environment, and that is the basis of natural selection. So we'll hear it a lot. When we talk about innate behavioral responses in organisms, we are going to see two major cases of movement, and this movement being in response to a stimulus. So one example that we are going to start with is taxis. So taxis can be positive. So positive taxis, that's positive as in we're going towards something, or away from is our negative taxis. And we can add different scientific roots onto the term taxis in order to communicate what we are responding to. So one of the most common ones that we'll hear is phototaxis. Phototaxis is a response of movement towards light. So for example, euglena, photosynthetic microorganisms, they require light as an energy source. They have chloroplasts. They are photosynthetic, meaning that when they detect light, they are going to move towards the light, a positive phototaxis. And so in an experiment, if we were to cover up a dish that contained our euglena within it, it would orient itself to the spaces where light was present. That would allow them to survive best in this environment. So we see how our behavior increases our survival, which makes us more likely to exhibit those behaviors and pass on those same innate behaviors to our offspring. Now, where taxis is a meaningful movement, we have more of a directional kind of generalization when we talk about kinesis. Kinesis is not a beeline to that point to that stimulus. It's more like we are using a radar and we're hearing those pings. And as the pings get louder, we move in general towards that area, but we're not still 100% sure where they are. So what we see in kinesis, which may also be positive or negative, depending on whether we're getting away from something or going towards something, this is a change in the rate of activity. So we have a faster movement when we detect a condition, whether that is something like a nutrient source, like we see in these wood lice, where we need moist conditions to help respirate in our environment. And if it's a dry condition, we may find that we are moving, just generally looking for that moisture. And once we detect that moisture, we start to move faster. We really want to get in there. So these are two types of innate behavioral responses. And we, as humans, exhibit many types of innate behavioral responses. You can think of these as your just automatic responses to things. But when we start getting a little bit more complicated is when it starts to get a little bit more interesting. One of the ways that we can determine whether something is genetically based or whether it has to do with the environment in which we grow in, this is that nature versus nurture type of idea, is through the application of what we call a cross-fostering study. If you're familiar with a foster parent or a foster child, it is a child from one family living with another family. So we can do this with laboratory organisms, mostly mice, where we place them in foster families and then we identify, did they display this particular trait? If they did display the trait, but they're living in a family that doesn't, that means that that trait is more likely, that behavioral response is more likely to be genetically based because they had it regardless of their environment. We can say the same thing if they don't respond in the way that we would expect them to when living in this foster family, then maybe that response has more to do with the environment in which that organism lives rather than its genetic predisposition. So we get into the idea that we can learn from our environment. We may have these innate set responses to things, but the more information we take in, the more we're able to mold that information and use that information to help us survive. So this is all-encompassing learning, and we're going to talk about a couple of different types of learning. But we have a modification of the innate behaviors based on our environment in order to influence how we behave. So we'll start first with the idea of imprinting. There was a really cute movie back in the 90s because, I'm a millennial teacher at this point, and I'm getting up there in age, but goodness knows I can't remember the name of this movie anymore, but it had to do with geese and their idea of imprinting. Imprinting is a key idea that juveniles, babies, should be able to recognize their parent, because being able to be recognized by your parent or being able to recognize your parent means that we have this protective environment. We may not be able to survive on our own yet, and so being able to have an established figure to help us survive increases the likelihood that we are going to make it past, day one. So imprinting is this idea that we have a response that is fixated on a particular individual. Now, this means that when the chicks hatch, they imprint on their parent and will follow their parent. That's how you get these cute little lines of ducks and geese, all following behind their parent. Now, the unique thing about imprinting is that it only happens during a specific time in their development, what we call a sensitive period. And that if they don't see the parent first, we don't get the same response. Instead, they will follow what they see first. So we have some examples of people being what these baby geese have imprinted upon, and so they will follow them around, which just sounds adorable. We can also talk about spatial learning. So spatial learning, if you think of spatial, space, the environment around you, being able to identify, oh, I have this on my desk, or I have this in my locker. We have a memory of the spatial structure of our environment. And usually this involves the development of what we call a cognitive map. It's an internal representation of the relationships in space between objects and your surroundings. So if you can close your eyes and you can picture your bedroom and you can see, oh, my desk is here, or my bed is here, or maybe my PlayStation's over here. Whatever you've got going on in there, you can probably picture it in your mind. That say you left your Chromebook at home and you could call up mom or dad and you could go, oh, mom and dad, I left it on the corner of my bed. I can close my eyes and I can see where I left that item. That is a cognitive map, which helps you in spatial learning. Organisms use this all the time to help them orient themselves in their environment, to identify things that may be important in the future. And it is another example of learning. Another one that those of you who have taken a psychology class may be familiar with is that of associative learning. So we're associating one thing with another thing. So we link features of our environment together. A really good example of this being classical conditioning, the Pavlovian response from our dog, that dog sees food and hears a bell ringing. Eventually, we can get to a point where even if we're just ringing the bell and there's no food present, the dog will salivate. We've associated these two stimuli together. And so even when the one that really should be creating this response is not present, but only the other one is, we will garner the same response at the end. All of these things that we've talked about so far are things that increase our ability to survive and reproduce in our environment. And so when we talk about fitness, we're going to talk about it a little bit now, we'll talk about it a lot later on, but whenever we have an increased likelihood of survival and the ability to reproduce, we say that something has fitness. This is Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest. They're not talking about that animals just went to the gym every day. Fitness is our ability to survive and reproduce. So we have these behaviors that give us a high evolutionary fitness because they give us a better chance to survive and pass on these genetics. And so natural selection, the environment is going to favor those traits that give us increased fitness. And a lot of the time, these behaviors are selfish. We need to survive. We're not always looking out for everybody else. We've got to catch ourselves first before we're able to help anybody else. But not all behaviors, not all traits are 100% selfish. There were a number of scientists who identified the idea that you have an increased benefit from working with others, which leads us into the idea of foraging. Even way back, early human evolution, we had foraging, these behaviors that obtain food so that we can make sure that we're able to continue to survive. No food, no energy, no survival. Very important concept. So we're looking for food. we're capturing food, we're eating food. All of these behaviors fall into those foraging behaviors. And we take these behaviors, and as long as we are getting an increased efficiency in our feeding, those are more likely to be passed on to our offspring. When we get these more successful traits, we're more likely to survive and reproduce. Another example of traits that may be beneficial to organisms in the long run that may require them to work together are these ideas of mating behaviors. So mating is going to involve the seeking of mates, the attracting of mates, choosing mates, competing for mates, and caring for offspring, what we would call like the parental care. And we have a couple of different mating systems that exist in nature, and the length and number of these relationships are going to vary among species depending on really what they need. So our main ones are monogamy. We have one male, one female. We have polygamy, and that is one male and many females. And we have polyandry, which is the opposite. We have many males and one female. This is really going to deal more with how many offspring we're producing, how much care these offspring need, and what our social structure looks like as a species and population overall. And these all fall into this category of cooperative behaviors. We're working together. So we've got the idea that as a society or as a group, we can increase the fitness overall of the population itself by working together. We see these types of behaviors in ants, beetles. A lot of those colonial species will work together, share the load to increase the fitness of the whole. You've got meerkats, which have a predator warning system, and then you've got some kin selection in there, where there are varying levels of how likely you are to help a member of your family. If you're fourth cousin 3 times removed, probably not super high on your priority list in terms of helping when compared to your own immediate offspring. And so these are what we consider altruistic behaviors. Altruism is the idea of that we're doing something for the good of our society. So altruistic behaviors are selfless. They reduce your individual fitness because you're putting yourself on the line. But overall, the population is gaining an increase in that fitness. We're giving up part of ourselves in order to increase the survivability of our population. So that is where I will wrap it up for our animals. That is a very brief overview. We could go into so much more depth with a lot of these ideas, and your textbook does do a great job going into more depth. So if you feel like you need more information, please do not hesitate. Crack open that textbook, take some notes, answer the questions at the end. Get what you need for this class out of it, because the more you put in, the better your results will be. But we're not quite done yet. Now that we've got to the end with animals, we're going to take a 180 and we'll talk about plant responses. Plant responses are going to be another one of those things that come up every once in a while. There's a little bit of plants everywhere, but we don't put a huge amount of focus on the plants like we do maybe with the microorganisms or animals. But unlike plants, unlike animals, goodness, which respond to stimuli through movement and behavior, plants really don't have that benefit. We have to respond to the environment by altering how we develop or how we grow. So we are going to be looking at plants and their responses in terms of tropisms. So tropisms are responses that are basically the curvature of your plant, and we can have positive tropisms, we can have negative tropisms, just like with our taxis and our kinesis, where we're dealing with a stimulus and whether or not we're going towards it or away from it. Got a couple of different ones. Again, the scientific roots will help tell you what the tropism is referring to. So phototropism, we are directing our movement towards or away from light. Gravitropism, we're talking about gravity. Your book, chapter 31, specifically goes into a lot of detail on these different types of tropisms. But another idea is that plants are being consumed, and a lot of the time they don't want to be consumed. You really wouldn't want to get eaten either. You're just out here trying to live your best plant life, and you don't want to be attacked or fall ill to disease or pathogens. So a lot of the times we get defensive. We find ways to make it more difficult for things to eat us, because the more difficult that it is for things to eat us, the more likely we are that we're going to pass on more genetics, that survivability, that reproduction, all leading back to fitness. So we have three major types of defenses that we are going to end our discussion with, and those are physical, chemical, and behavioral. So physical defenses may include structures, things like thorns, trichomes, that decrease the likelihood that something is going to want to touch you. Chemical defenses, we've got toxic compounds, we've got things that may smell bad. So, maybe you don't want to be around them. Maybe you don't want to eat this thing that smells really terrible and probably doesn't taste very good if you actually eat it. And then behavioral defenses are things like the recruitment of predators. So if you are more likely to be eaten by something, sometimes it's really handy to make a pheromone that attracts a predator of that predator. And that way you kind of counter all of that excess herbivory that you are experiencing. But that is where we are going to end it for this first presentation. And we're coming in at a little over 30 minutes. So in the future, if you feel like you need to take a break or not take all this in at one point, that is perfectly fine. That's the whole point of the lectures being in a video form, so that you can take your time, get what you need out of this class, because I want to see each and every one of you succeed. But if you have any questions, anything that you want me to respond to directly in class, please leave it on the video, or actually come talk to me in class. That's even better. Email me, smoke signals, whatever you have, and I will catch you in the next video. See everybody.